Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
Hi, I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And today, Talli, we're going to be continuing our discussion about the Netflix series Unorthodox, which, as people who listened to our last podcast know, has generated significant discussion. This is the mini-series, which is based on the book by Devorah Feldman, where she describes her Samar upbringing and how she eventually left Orthodox Judaism. Now, the mini-series is fictional, even though it's based on the book. And a lot of the discussion surrounding that show is how true to life it actually is and how it raises important issues that touch upon universal issues of intimacy, agency, consent, balancing cultural or religious sensitivity and norms with values that are unassailable in the Western world. And we wanted to follow up on that panel discussion, which was a really wonderful experience for me. I learned a lot, with a follow-up giving some of our own opinions about those same ideas.
If anyone hasn't yet listened to our Zoom panel, please do so. You can listen to it on our previous podcast, or you can watch it on the Zoom link and YouTube link, which we will provide in our show notes.
As well as on the Intimate Judaism Facebook page.
I had a really good time on that panel. I think it was a really interesting one. We had fantastic guests, and they really contributed a lot to the conversation. I think that the two of us should spend some time processing it a little bit and finding a little bit more of our thoughts, since we were pretty focused on what our presenters had to say.
Before we delve into that, Talli, I want to thank our listeners for listening to Intimate Judaism. We appreciate everybody sharing and promoting the podcast. We, again, as we've mentioned before, are excited as the podcast has continued to grow and reaches an ever larger audience. With your help, we'll continue to help people all over the world continue conversations about intimacy, sexuality, and Judaism. Make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. And please continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Also, make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com as well as tallirosenbaum.com. Talli, what were some of the thoughts you had in listening to the panel last week?
So I actually watched it again this morning because it's very interesting that when you are doing a program, you don't really pay as much attention as when you're watching it afterwards. We had a good opportunity to talk about issues of who can consent. If you get married at such a young age, are you able to consent? Yudis kept referring to the wedding night as inherently traumatic. We talked about whether being so identified with your religion and your belief system protects you from the wedding night being inherently traumatic. And some different therapists brought up the tension between trying to maintain cultural sensitivity and bringing in your own kind of opinion or outlook about what's really healthy, what's sexually healthy, and how to navigate that. So a few things came up for me because I think it's important to comment on that. I think that's interesting to therapists and to lay people to hear that sort of tension. I think that our listeners also should be getting more information, though, about some of the problem areas that came up. For example, what do we do about painful sex? I think we should talk a little bit about that. And for example, what do we do about a lack of education? And how can we better educate premaritally to understand more about sexual anatomy and sexual physiology and pleasure? So I think we should spend a few minutes talking about these subjects as we kind of process the panel. And then, we didn't really talk that much about the mini-series itself. And I'd like to spend a minute or two, even though, that was kind of our bait and switch. And I see that just about every night this week, there's another panel on this topic. I think that there's also some things to say about that as well.
Talli, let me first talk about what I thought of the miniseries. It's a 4-part miniseries. It's approximately 4 hours long. It was reasonably entertaining. On the whole, I thought it was not actually that good. I have to say, I never read the original book by Devorah Feldman. My wife did. So she was able to compare the two, and she watched the miniseries before I did. And she also felt that the story itself, a fictionalized version of the book, was okay. Among my various complaints about the miniseries itself is I think there's an element of being sensationalized, which obviously is part of any TV show or movie. You want to do that because you want to entertain people. But I think there were elements of it which were simply unnecessary. For example, there's one scene, which I actually didn't watch, where she walks topless into the mikveh. There's no purpose to that other than to try to titillate people and tantalize people and have a topless scene. I don't understand why they would include something like that. But more to the point that we're dealing with now is I felt this movie, if it were not made largely by Jews, which I know by looking at the credits, it almost seemed anti-Semitic to me. Because of all of the characters, everyone who was Jewish, with the exception of the protagonist Esti, was essentially a villain or a fool. The only Jewish person who was not a villain or a fool was the one friend of hers in Berlin who was Jewish from Israel. And among all of her friends in Berlin, that one person was the cruelest of all of her friends. She was the one who had to tell her the truth that you're not a good pianist. Why is it that every single Jew here is stereotypical? Every single Jew is essentially made out to be stupid or evil or cruel. And to me, that's really a shame.
I hear you, Scott. I don't agree with you, though. It's not for me to agree, just this was your experience. I didn't have the same experience of watching it, although I do agree with the part about the black and white kind of binary nature of secular being good and nice and religious being oppressive and not nice. I think that was done in a black and white way. And also her journey also was done a little bit in too much of a black and white. One day she's in Williamsburg and the next day she's in Berlin eating a ham sandwich. That's quite a stretch. In fact, we know that the journey is a very long one. It's quite painful. It's quite complex. But as far as the authenticity, it's interesting because I've spoken to many Hasidic women who I treat who really felt that they were charmed by how authentic it was, and they were also validated by the stories presented. And I actually found it to be quite touching. I found the scene of her singing beautiful. It brought tears to my eyes. I didn't think it was anti-Semitic, although I hear why you would say that. But that's really all I want to talk about in terms of the miniseries itself. I think it also brought a lot of awareness to the topics that we're going to be able to open up. And that's what's important as well.
For sure. And it is not for me to start defending Satmar. It's not something which I have any particular interest in doing. So the fact that I found this miniseries to be in some ways foolish doesn't have anything to do with whether it's accurate or not in its depiction of the Hasidic world. I thought it was too black and white in that sense. But ever since I watched it and in preparing for this podcast and in listening to our panelists the other day, it's very clear to me that this is, at least for many people, a true-to-life portrait, even if it is stylized in many ways. So I can't deny that some of the problems that it raises are absolutely true. And if we try to pretend that this isn't a real problem in the Hasidic world, or at least in the Satmar world, we're only fooling ourselves.
And I think that the point that I tried to make in the panel was that when it comes to the need to have sex, the need to get it over with, the need to quote unquote succeed, the cultural messages are pretty universal. And I think that we're all Esti and Yankee at some point. And I think that was an important message because I don't necessarily think that the modern Orthodox world is necessarily that far ahead when it comes to refraining from provoking and perpetuating anxiety in young couples over the wedding night. Being afraid and being nervous about the first time continues to be an issue, and it doesn't really have to be that way. So I think that that's one point that we tried to make. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. I want to ask you about that in your role as a therapist. How much is that attributable to the way that Chatan and Kala classes are currently taught? And how much of it is simply a function of a couple is getting married? Very often they've practiced abstinence until now, whether they're Jewish or not. and there's going to be anxiety on the wedding night. Is that because the Chatan and Kala classes are failing, or is it simply a function of the fact that this is the day they're going to have sex for the first time? And I wouldn't necessarily blame the Chatan and Kala classes or their teachers for not preparing them. People who are not taking Chatan and Kala classes because they're not in that religious world might have that exact same anxiety.
I think that the idea that Chatan and Kala classes are what prepares people for an intimate life is not a practical one and is not a true one. We are prepared for sexual intimacy from the moment we're born. We are prepared for sexuality throughout our lifetime. And the idea that you are not a sexual person until you sit in front of a Chatan and Kala instructor and they tell you how to do sex, which is in essence how to get the penis into the vagina. And that is the message. The depiction of the Kala teacher was extreme, but in a sense, this is what Kala teachers do. They talk about what's going to happen on the first night and how lubricants can help it happen. And there is unfortunately not enough talk about when you are ready, then you will naturally want to go the next step, which is what a natural process happens when there aren't those restrictions. So yes, the expectation to go from zero physical intimacy to having intercourse in one night is a very difficult one for every population that does that, but this is mitigated by something else. And Sarah Shapiro alluded to this as well. It's the connection. Can we create a more intimate emotional connection between couples before the wedding night so that you are in essence not expected to go to bed with a stranger? Can you communicate with one another, your fears, your vulnerabilities? And part of the problem is, and I've heard this over and over, that not only do couples not do that, in many societies they are discouraged from doing that. And I had a couple once, and I generally don't like to talk about stories of my couples, but this is an important one where, she had come from a background of abuse, and it was very important for her to be able to talk to her Chatan about her fears. She wanted to be able to tell him that she needed time and wanted to be able to talk to him, and he wouldn't allow it. He said, I asked my Rav, and he said not to talk about intimacy before marriage. The fear being that it would arouse in him desire and something bad would happen. And this was a real problem in the work that we did because she was very angry and resentful about the missed opportunity to talk about it beforehand.
And this is an example of what I mentioned at the end of that podcast, at the end of that panel discussion, where rabbis going out of their own lane and giving advice in areas where they just don't know what they're talking about. Yes, in an ideal world, I use the word ideal as in a pure halachic construct type of world, a rabbi can say, of course, you shouldn't talk about sex before you have the opportunity to have sex. That's not something which is appropriate. However, obviously in this situation where the Kala needed to discuss her fears and her anxieties with her Chatan before they get married, for the rabbi to then give advice or halachic psak that they can't talk about it, unfortunately the rabbi doesn't know what he's talking about. He has no right to discuss matters like that when these deal with issues of mental health, where he's not equipped to deal with these things, where he doesn't have the training or the skills to talk about them.
Exactly, but it even goes beyond that. Even if there wasn't a mental health issue, even if there wasn't a background of abuse, it's a couple's right to be able to talk to one another about intimacy before they get married. And to have your rabbi tell you not to do that, it's destructive. I think that we are talking about how can we change the system across the board. So one way is to promote communication and connection between the couple without so much fear about what might happen. So that's one point. The other point is the idea of more information about your body and about pleasure. And at this point, I'd like to thank Chaya Feuerman, who is a psychotherapist colleague in New York, who we spoke to, and unfortunately we're not really able to use the recording because the recording was of poor quality. But Chaya had asked me if she could contribute her experience as not only a therapist, but as a very religious young Kala who had asked permission from her parents to go to a more modern type of Kala teacher, and her experiences were quite difficult.
It's unfortunate, Talli, that our Zoom interview with Chaya Feuerman didn't record properly because she really brought up some very important points. Fortunately, Chaya did send us an email afterwards with an outline of what she wanted to tell us. So I'm going to read that right now. I should also mention that Chaya Feuerman is a trauma specialist certified in EMDR and IFS. And this is what she wrote to us. 7 basic points that she wants to emphasize. 1. My young female clients, who come from both Hasidic and yeshiva communities, have nearly identical experiences in Kala classes to my own, which took place 31 years ago. 2. I come from a yeshiva family background. I knew I wanted a Kala teacher who was more open-minded and would provide sex education, whatever that meant to me at the time. I sought out a popular Kala teacher who was considered more modern by my family standards and had to staunchly advocate for myself to see this particular Kala teacher. Ironically, there was no sex education in those classes at all, and it was a great disappointment. So much for going to the modern Kala teacher, modern in quotes. Number 3, there was no reference to female sexuality. The joys of sex were not mentioned at all. The content of classes were numerous pages of rules, and there was nothing in it for us as brides. It was all about procreating and its being a mitzvah. In fact, we were instructed to think about God and holy things during sexual intercourse. 4. Zeh hamakom, Hebrew for that place, was the only term used throughout, the message being that female bodies are used but are not to be spoken about. 5. Sexual terms, such as orgasm and clitoris, were not mentioned, and there were no Hebrew words for them mentioned either. 6. I was haunted for years, as the following 8 words were repeated multiple times throughout the classes. Just do what he tells you to do. There was no explanation, I had no idea what I might be asked to do, and I was afraid to ask. And number 7. When real life happened, and I discovered that my husband was a lot more open to sexual pleasure on both sides, and nothing would ever be coerced or demanded of me, still, the above 8 words left an indelible mark on me. That is, after I did come to realize that women can have sexual pleasure too, I felt guilty, like sexual pleasure was illicit, stolen goods. It took years to undo that message. Those are all very, very important points, and we thank Chaya for being so open with us.
These points are quite difficult points, and I want to thank Chaya again for sharing them. And I think that what we can learn from this is that we have a way to go. And I appreciate very much the efforts of Diana Melnick and other Kala teachers, the Eden Center, which is really doing a great job in Kala teacher education, led by sex therapists, Jody Walks-Press and Lizzie Rubin. And I think that in the more modern world, there's a lot of improvement, and hopefully that is going to spread throughout the Orthodox world.
And I think on the positive side, there certainly is an opportunity in the fact that we have Chatan and Kala classes, even though these are technically opportunities to learn about the halachot of Taharat HaMishpacha, the laws of Nida, and the times when a husband and wife can be together sexually and times when they cannot be intimate sexually. At the same time, obviously, knowing what we know in terms of the problems that exist, this is a chance to really educate and provide a greater sex education than many people may have had in the past. And I think people like Diana Melnick are really trying to include that in their curricula. And so I think that's certainly an important aspect of what can be done in the future. I also want to mention that an important point was made during the panel discussion. It was a bit of a disagreement between Yehudis Fletcher and Diana Melnick, and I don't believe there's a resolution. They're both right. And that is that Yehudis was pointing out the importance of emphasizing that they don't have to have sexual intercourse the first night. They're allowed to take time, more than allowed to, but they should be encouraged to do it at a pace which is right for them. And that's very good and strong and logical advice. Diana Melnick said, on the other hand, a person who feels bound by halacha, who looks at halacha as normative, is going to have the problem that if they don't have any form of sexual intercourse by the time she first gets her period, let's say it's a few days later or a week later, there are serious halachic questions about whether they're allowed to be in yichud together, or if they have to have a child stay with them until the next time she goes to the mikveh. I don't have a resolution to that problem, but I acknowledge the fact that a person who's coming and looking at it from a halachic perspective is going to be fundamentally at odds with the viewpoint that says take as long as you want and be as relaxed as you want. If you're not ready for sexual intercourse by the time that she gets her period, that's okay. Well, it is okay, but it leads to all sorts of halachic problems, and a person who is in the halachic system is going to have to deal with that and can't ignore that.
I hear what you're saying. I have worked with couples in unconsummated marriages that have lasted more than a year, and never has there been any psak halacha practically, and I've worked with many couples from many different types of orthodoxy, and never have I heard it be a rabbinic psak halacha ruling that they are not allowed to be in yichud together. I mean, it actually makes no sense. What's going to happen? They're not having sex when they're allowed to have sex. They're certainly not going to have sex when they're not allowed to have sex. So I don't really think that that's a relevant halacha practically. I've never heard it being ruled. So unless you know differently.
I'll say it like this. It's complicated. I'll just say that. It's complicated. It's not simple, because let's take the simple example. Let's say, for example, she goes into Nida that afternoon. The afternoon after the wedding. She got married on a Sunday morning, and Sunday afternoon she goes into Nida. There, it's pretty clear that they cannot be in yichud together. But the question is this: why didn't they have sex? That's the question.
Okay, so the question about why they didn't have sex.
Meaning, if they don't have sex because they simply choose not to for a day or 2 days or 3 days, that's when there might be more room for leniency. The Trumat Hadeshen says that. Effectively, because they didn't have sex when they had the opportunity, we are not concerned that they will be overcome with passion and thereby break the laws of Nida, and accordingly, we're not worried about yichud. On the other hand, if there are other reasons for them not having sex, then it might be more difficult to be lenient. There are all sorts of opinions by modern poskim to talk about this particular issue. I know Rav Moshe Feinstein weighs in on it. I know the Chazon Ish weighs in on it. Another point I should also say is, what is the definition of intercourse? It doesn't necessarily mean full consummation. It might simply be that there is some minimal penetration or something along those lines. Ultimately, a couple needs to speak to a halachic authority if halacha is a factor for them in making these decisions.
Scott, I want to bring to your attention that we're speaking very different languages, and that's okay. You're talking about, should we give them more time, or should we understand why they're not having sex so that we can rule this way or that way? And I realize that you as a rabbi have those important halachic considerations. What I'm trying to tell you is that there is another side to these halachic considerations. Practically speaking, when a college teacher says to a woman who has aversion and fear and trauma, whether she has been sexually abused in the past or not, and she says to her, there has to be nishikat evarim, which means your genitals have to touch. They have to touch, because if your genitals don't touch, then you and your husband will get into a lot of complications, and you will have to have a child staying in your apartment with you. That creates a great deal of anxiety and tension. And again, I'm not saying that the halakha is not important. Of course, we value it very much, but I'm saying that we have to understand the human element. And that is why I think that Yiddish had so much to offer in terms of understanding the balance, that tension between a woman and a man's feeling of autonomy with their bodies and the need to protect against certain activities which could be triggering, and their need to fulfill an obligation. That tension is there. And I think that we're bringing kind of extreme examples,
Right.
But it's not so extreme, because many couples do take a very long time, sometimes months, to be able to consummate the marriage fully. And that leads to your question of why. So it's very important here too. There was a tremendously difficult scene in the movie where Esty is just like clenching her teeth to be able to get it over with, and it was excruciatingly painful. Now, it's important to say this: sex should not hurt. It shouldn't hurt, not even the first time. Sex is not supposed to hurt, and if it does, there's probably a very good reason, and that reason is usually due to a combination of physical and emotional factors because they don't really get isolated very well. If you have pain, you're going to contract in response to that pain in order to protect yourself. You're going to have anxiety because pain and anxiety work together in a cyclical way. So it's really an important message to send to our listeners that it's not something that you have to just get through. It's not something that you have to grit your teeth and bear it. And it's not something that you need to do regardless of the fact that it hurts because your husband needs it. You need to be able to communicate and find a way, and you need to find specialists who deal with sexual pain. Like Diana was saying, there are physical therapists, there are doctors, there are sex therapists, and there are people, psychotherapists, couples therapists, who are able to navigate this together with you. And it's not just vaginismus. Vaginismus really is one specific type of condition, but there's a lot of overlap between conditions relating to vaginal pain, better known as vulvodynia, which encapsulates the entire area. So that's just one other thing that I wanted to put out there.
Okay, Talli, do you have any other thoughts about either the panel or the miniseries before we finish up?
Well, not so much about the miniseries, but about the panel. I think it was really interesting for listeners, therapists, and lay people alike when we got to the part about the questions in the end, which were, how do I as a therapist navigate? And there were actually 3 therapists who asked pretty much a very similar question. How do I remain culturally sensitive when I'm feeling all these feelings inside me that there's something happening here that's not okay? And both of the therapists on our panel answered in a similar way by saying, I would provide psychoeducation and I would say what's needed medically, and I would separate that from what their cultural values are and say, well, if this is going to be a conflict for you, then we can talk to a rabbi. I would like to present a little bit of a different approach. One of the questioners was Shifra, when she talked about how her client spoke about sex by calling it being available to my husband. And she said, I'm having a very hard time with the idea of calling it being available to your husband. And she kind of presented that conflict.
I remember she said this like borrowing a lawnmower.
Yeah, and I think the other therapists too used the opportunity for psychoeducation, which presented the conflict. My way of working would be to have the person be able to figure out that conflict by themselves. In other words, I would ask the woman who says, make myself available, I would stay really curious and say, you're using the term make yourself available. What do you mean by that? And she might say, well, I mean, when he wants it, I need to be available for him so that he can do it. And then I might say, I want to understand that more. So sex for you is making yourself available for when he wants it. What does that feel like for you? And that will usually be the time where she might be confronted with how she really feels about that. And so that conflict is there. It is likely to come up in therapy, but there's a way to have it come up in therapy where the therapist presents the conflict, and then the person in therapy needs to be able to now, and sometimes they might be anxious, oh no, I have to talk to my rabbi now, because now my therapist presented a conflict between what's right for me in terms of my mental health, my physical health, my emotional health, and now that's in conflict with what I'm supposed to be doing religiously. Or they create the conflict because they've been avoiding that conflict. So if they can confront it on their own, I find that to be more useful in a therapeutic way.
This idea of discovering the conflicts and acknowledging the conflicts that we face and our attempts to integrate different sides of ourselves as well as different values is something which in the Orthodox world we deal with every day.
Yeah, look, I think that at the end of the day, it really does become about how do I integrate different sides of myself. And we've spoken about that many times in our podcast before. So I think this is going to be it in terms of Unorthodox, 2 podcasts about that. And this was a lot of fun. So thanks, and thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time on the Intimate Judaism Podcast.